The morning of my 18th birthday, I woke up to a suitcase sitting outside my bedroom door. Not packed by me. Already zipped shut. A sticky note on top in my mother's neat cursive. Everything you'll need. We'll talk at dinner. I stood there in the hallway of that house in Portland, Oregon, in my socks, staring at that suitcase like it was a grenade someone had already pulled the pin on. I should have known. Looking back now, every sign had been there for years. But when you love people, you find reasons to look away from the signs. My name is Nadia. I was adopted at 6 years old out of a foster home in Eugene. My birth mother had been 22, alone, and sick in ways she couldn't fix. She passed away when I was 4. I don't remember her face without photographs. What I do remember is the smell of the foster home industrial cleaner and something that tried to be lavender, and the way my father looked when he and my mother came to take me home. He had kind eyes back then. He crouched down to my level in that intake room and said, "You're ours now." I believed him for 12 years. My sister was born 2 years after they brought me home. She wasn't adopted. She came the way my parents had always wanted, naturally, in the middle of the night, screaming and red-faced and absolutely theirs in every way that a child could be. I loved her anyway. I helped my mother with the diapers. I read to her at night. I taught her how to ride a bike in the driveway on Westover Road, held the back of the seat until my arms gave out. She never once said thank you, but I didn't need her to. What I needed was to belong. And for a long time, I told myself I did. The dinner that night was quiet. My father sat at the head of the table and didn't touch his food. My mother kept smoothing her napkin over and over on her lap. My sister ate fast, eyes down, and asked to be excused before anyone else was halfway through. The second she disappeared up the stairs, my mother set down her fork and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not anger. Something worse. Calculation. She said they'd talked it over carefully. She said 18 was a milestone, a real one. She said the house was too small now that my sister was getting older and needed space. She said they'd been carrying 2 college funds, but the money wasn't there anymore. And with only one to divide, it made more sense to focus on their daughter. Their daughter. That's how she said it. Not your sister, their daughter. My father finally looked up. He said I was a good kid, that they'd always be proud of me, that they'd given me 12 years of stability and love, and that was more than most people got. He said it the way people read from a script they wrote days ago, and practiced until the feeling was gone. I asked what happened to my college fund. A silence settled over the table that told me everything before he opened his mouth. My sister had totaled her car at a party in Beaverton 3 weeks earlier. Blood alcohol twice the limit. They'd paid to make the charges disappear, hired a lawyer, settled with the other driver out of court. My college fund had covered most of it. The rest came from a second mortgage they weren't telling me about. I sat with that for a long moment. The candle on the table was the only birthday thing in the room. One candle. Not even in a cake. I said, "You spent my future to protect her from consequences she earned." My mother said, "That's not a fair way to look at it." I stood up, picked up that suitcase they'd already packed for me, and walked out the front door without looking back. I'd like to say I cried. I didn't. I just walked. I had $400 in a savings account and a contact at a women's shelter on Burnside who'd once spoken at my high school. I called her from a payphone outside a gas station, and she gave me a bed. I spent the next 6 weeks learning which diners hired off the books, which libraries stayed open until 9, and how to make $40 stretch for 5 days. I got a job at a breakfast spot off Southeast Hawthorne cracked tile floor, coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since 1987, regulars who tipped in exact change. I worked doubles. I smiled. I saved every dollar I could, and told myself that this was just a detour, not a destination. On a Tuesday morning in March, 7 weeks after my birthday, I was refilling the sugar dispensers at the counter when a woman in a gray blazer walked in and sat at the far stool. She didn't look at the menu. She looked at me. When I came over, she slid a business card across the counter and asked if my name was Nadia. I said yes and stepped back without knowing why. Her name was Margaret Ellison, she said. She was an estate attorney out of Seattle. She'd been looking for me for 11 days. My birth mother's aunt had passed away 6 weeks earlier at the age of 87. I had no idea this woman existed. She told me the woman's name, my great-aunt on my birth mother's side, and said she had built her life from nothing, owned 3 small commercial properties in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, and had spent the last 20 years quietly funding a scholarship fund for foster youth in Washington and Oregon. The total estate, after taxes and fees, came to a little over $4 million. I put down the sugar dispenser. She kept going. She said my great-aunt had hired an investigator 2 years before she died to find any living blood relative of her late niece, my birth mother. That investigator had found me still in school, still at that house on Westover Road. My great-aunt had updated her will 6 months before she passed. Everything went to me. But there was a condition. If you want to comment something and let me know, have you ever had someone choose you after everyone else walked away? Drop it below. Keep watching. Because what came next changed everything. Margaret paid for her coffee and a piece of pie she didn't eat, and walked me through it in that corner booth while the breakfast rush thinned out around us. My great-aunt had been taken in by a stranger at 17. Pregnant, alone, in Seattle during a winter that killed people who slept outside. A woman she'd never met before let her sleep on a cot in the back of a bakery for 2 months, no conditions, no cost. My great-aunt had never forgotten that. She'd spent the back half of her life trying to multiply that one act until it reached people she'd never personally meet. The condition of the will was specific. Within 4 years of accepting the estate, I had to personally ensure that no fewer than 60 young people between the ages of 14 and 22 who were experiencing homelessness or aging out of foster care received 3 things: stable housing, a clear educational or vocational path, and documented follow-through for at least 1 year. I had to be present in person for each intake. I had to sign the verification myself. An independent auditor approved by the estate would review every case. If I hit 60 before the 4-year mark, the estate transferred to me fully and unconditionally. If I failed or walked away, the entire amount went to a permanent endowment administered by a Seattle nonprofit. No appeals. Margaret looked at me across the booth. She said, "You have until tonight to decide." I thought about my mother's neat cursive on that sticky note. I thought about the way my father had said their daughter. I thought about the 6 weeks I'd spent learning which soup kitchens didn't ask for ID and which bus shelters stayed dry enough to sleep in if you positioned yourself right against the back wall. I told Margaret yes, before she finished her coffee. The estate closed 4 weeks later. I gave my notice at the diner, thanked the owner, and drove up to Seattle in a used Civic I bought with the first distribution from the operating fund Margaret had set up. I had never been to Capitol Hill in my life. I found a small office above a frame shop on Pike Street, signed a 6-month lease, and sat down at a folding table with a yellow legal pad and wrote the name of the organization across the top of the first page. I called it Second Door, because every kid I intended to help had already had one door slammed on them. The first person I found wasn't who I expected. I was 3 weeks in, still building the intake process, still meeting with social workers and shelter coordinators across King County. I was leaving a meeting at a youth shelter on Capitol Hill at 11 at night, when I found a girl sitting on the concrete steps around the side of the building, shoes soaked through, arms around her knees. She was 14. She'd been turned away because the shelter was over capacity. She had a backpack with 2 changes of clothes and a library book on marine biology that was 3 weeks overdue. Her name was Gracie. She'd been in foster care since she was 9. Her most recent placement had disrupted when the foster family moved out of state and didn't include her in the move. Not abandoned with malice, she told me that herself. Chin up, matter of fact. The way kids talk about devastating things when they've had enough time to stop expecting anyone to react, just left behind by accident, like an umbrella. The system was supposed to catch her. The system had a waiting list. I sat down on those steps beside her. I asked if she'd eaten. She said no. I asked if she had anywhere to go. She said she'd been hoping the shelter might have space open by midnight. I told her I had a couch in my office and a bag of groceries I'd bought that afternoon and hadn't touched yet. I asked if she wanted to come figure something out. She looked at me for a long time, long enough that I didn't rush her. Then she stood up and picked up her backpack and said, "Okay." That was case number 1. By the end of the first year, Second Door had officially helped 19 young people secure housing and enrollment in either school or a vocational program. I rented a second space, a 4-bedroom house in the Central District that could hold 8 residents with a house manager on site. I hired 2 caseworkers, both formerly in foster care themselves. Margaret connected me with a foundation in Bellevue that funded a second operating grant. The work was relentless and slow, and the most purposeful thing I had ever done with a single day of my life. Gracie turned 15 that spring. She was sharp in the way that kids who've had to be sharp to survive always are. She could read a room in 4 seconds, remembered everything anyone ever told her, and had opinions about everything from marine ecosystems to the best way to make rice and beans stretch for a week. She started helping with the younger residents after school, just naturally, without being asked. She'd sit with the new kids on their first night and explain how things worked, which caseworker was which, where the cereal was, that it was okay to cry and also okay not to. She had a way of making scared people feel less alone that I couldn't have taught her. She was born with it. By the second year, Second Door had 41 verified cases. I was putting in 16-hour days and running on black coffee and something that felt like purpose. We'd expanded to a second house in Rainier Valley and started a partnership with a trade school in Renton that offered fully funded slots for our graduates. I'd found a part-time therapist who donated 8 hours a week and a retired teacher who ran a homework club every Tuesday and Thursday. It was on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd year, standing in the hallway of the Capitol Hill office reviewing case files for a verification audit, when my assistant knocked and said someone was here asking to see me. 3 people, actually. No appointment. I knew before I got to the lobby. My father looked 20 years older than he'd looked on my 18th birthday. He'd lost weight he couldn't spare, and his skin had that dull gray color that sits just under the surface when something is wrong with a person's heart. He was holding a printout from a hospital billing office. My mother stood slightly behind him, handbag gripped in both hands, eyes that kept moving around the room and never landing anywhere. My sister was by the door. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, and there was a tight, angry energy around her that made the receptionist lean slightly back in her chair. I stood at the entrance to the hallway and didn't move. My father saw me first. He said my name. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know where else to go. The hospital had given him a diagnosis, congestive heart failure, one valve already significantly damaged. The out-of-pocket for the surgery he needed was somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000. They'd lost their insurance the previous fall when my mother's company downsized and cut benefits. The second mortgage on the house was 6 months behind. My sister had 2 pending DUI charges in Multnomah County from incidents in the last year. They needed a lawyer, and they needed it soon, and someone had told them I'd done well for myself. My mother started crying quietly. My sister stared at the floor. I looked at the 3 of them for a long moment. Long enough to feel everything I'd spent 3 years putting in careful order inside myself. Not hatred, I want to be clear about that. I had stopped being able to hate them somewhere around the end of the first year, when I'd watched enough kids cycle through our doors to understand that broken people usually came from broken places. I didn't hate them. I also didn't owe them what they'd come to collect. I said I would be right back. I went to my office and printed 3 separate documents. I came back to the lobby and set them on the table between us. My father's folder contained a printout from the Washington State Health Care Authority, showing he qualified for Apple Health under the expanded coverage income thresholds, along with contact information for 2 hospitals in King County with charity care programs specifically designed for cardiac patients with no insurance and a combined household income under $60,000. There was also a list of 3 cardiac care social workers at those hospitals who I'd personally worked with on other cases. My mother's folder had the contact information for the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services Benefits Navigator Office, 2 financial counseling nonprofits that handled foreclosure prevention, and a job placement service in Portland that specialized in mid-career professionals who'd been displaced by corporate layoffs. My sister's folder held the number for the Oregon State Bar's lawyer referral service for low-income residents, the contact for the Multnomah County DUII diversion program, and information on 2 outpatient treatment centers in the Portland area that took state insurance. I sat down across from them, and I said, clearly and without raising my voice, Second Door's mandate under its founding trust covers young people between 14 and 22 years old who are experiencing housing instability. None of you qualify. These are every public and nonprofit resource I know of that serves adults in the situations you're describing. That is what I'm able to give you. My mother said, "You have $4 million." I said, "I have an estate held in a restricted trust that I am legally and ethically obligated to use for a specific purpose. If I diverted funds to family members, I would be in violation of the trust terms, and every case we've verified for 3 years could be contested." My sister said I was unbelievable. She said I'd always thought I was better than them. She said some things I won't repeat here. My father put his face in his hands. I stood up. I picked up the 3 folders and set them each in front of the person they belonged to. I said, "I hope you use these. I genuinely do. Please don't come back." I walked back to my office and closed the door. I sat at my desk and stared at the wall for a long time. Then I pulled out the case file I'd been reviewing before they arrived. A 16-year-old named Marcus, just placed in transitional housing in Rainier Valley, enrolled in a welding program at the Renton Trade School starting Monday. Case 48. I picked up the pen. I signed the verification form. I kept going. My father did get into the charity care program at one of the hospitals I'd listed. I found this out through Margaret, who kept tabs as a professional courtesy. The surgery happened 6 weeks after that day in my lobby. He survived it. He and my mother lost the house in Portland to foreclosure in the fall and moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Gresham. I didn't hear from either of them. My sister entered the DUI diversion program and then dropped out of it 3 months in. She was arrested the following spring after her 3rd incident and received a suspended license, mandatory treatment, and 2 years of supervised probation. I read it in a Multnomah County court notice that a contact forwarded to me. I sat with that for an evening and then I let it go. Case 59 came in October, a 17-year-old from Tacoma who'd aged out of a group home placement when the facility lost its license. I drove down myself to do the intake, the way I did for every case. He was quiet and methodical and wanted to be an electrician. We got him into an apprenticeship program and a room in our second house within 2 weeks. One more. Gracie was 16 by then, 2 years into living at the Capitol Hill house, 6 months from graduating high school a year early. She'd started talking about marine biology programs at University of Washington. She ran our Tuesday homework club now, supervised the new arrivals on their first week, and had quietly become the reason half the residents stayed when things got hard. She was also, if I was being completely honest with myself, the reason I had kept going on the days when the paperwork was impossible and the funding fell short, and I ate dinner at my desk at 10:30 at night, wondering if I was doing any of this right. I'd been thinking about something for months. I'd talked to Margaret about it in careful circles, making sure I understood every legal implication before I brought it up to anyone else. Case 60 came in the first week of November. A 15-year-old girl named Priya, referred by a school counselor in Bellevue. Both parents had been deported 6 months earlier. She'd been staying with a neighbor, then a classmate's family, then no one. She showed up to second door with a backpack and a folder she'd organized herself containing all her school records, immunization history, and a handwritten list of things she needed help with in order of priority. That list made me want to cry and laugh at the same time. It said, 1. Somewhere safe to sleep. 2. To stay at my school. 3. To call my mom. We handled all 3 within 48 hours. The independent auditor arrived the following Monday. She reviewed every file, every signed verification, every 12-month follow-up documentation. She was there for 3 hours. When she finished, she closed her binder, shook my hand, and said, 60 verified cases. 4 years starts now, and you finished in 3.5. Margaret called at 9 that evening. The trust transfer had been initiated. Fully unconditional, fully mine, effective the following business day. I stood in the kitchen of the Capitol Hill house while the residents watched a movie in the living room. Gracie was on the couch with Priya, who'd been with us 3 weeks and still sat a little carefully, the way people do when they're not sure yet if the good thing is real. I could hear someone laughing at something on the screen. I could smell the popcorn. I had thought, when this moment came, that it would feel like victory. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like a door opening onto a much larger room, and I was standing at the threshold with everything ahead of me. The ceremony was held on a Saturday in February at the Seattle Foundation's annual gala in South Lake Union. I wore a dark green dress I'd bought on sale at a consignment shop in Capitol Hill that Gracie had picked out, holding it up from the rack with absolute confidence and saying, "This one, don't argue." The ballroom was full of people in formal wear, foundation directors and city council members and nonprofit leaders and the kind of donors whose names are on buildings. I was 22 years old and I felt absolutely none of what I probably should have felt about being in that room. The executive director read the citation. 3 years of work condensed into numbers: 60 verified cases, 49 currently in stable housing, 38 enrolled in education or vocational programs, an 89% retention rate among graduates at the 12-month mark. The room applauded. I waited for it to settle. I said thank you. I said the number 60 was the floor we'd built everything on, and the work was still early. I said I'd started this because someone I'd never met decided that a stranger's life was worth something, and that a condition attached to a gift could be an act of love if the condition was the right one. Then I said there was something else I needed to do before I sat down. I turned to the side of the stage. Gracie was standing just off stage in the dress she'd borrowed from our house manager, 17 years old, chin up, watching me with that expression she had where she was trying to look like she wasn't feeling everything at once. I said, "Gracie, can you come out here?" She walked out slowly. The room went quiet the way rooms do when something unrehearsed is happening. I said, 3.5 years ago, I sat down on some steps outside a shelter at 11 at night next to a kid who had a library book about marine biology in her backpack. She was the first person Second Door ever helped. She's also the reason I didn't quit on approximately 40 separate occasions when quitting would have been the rational choice. I looked at her directly. Last week, the King County Family Court approved my petition for legal guardianship. Gracie is my daughter. That's effective as of Thursday. The room took a breath, and then it exhaled all at once. Gracie's face did something I'd only seen it do twice, broke open completely, every careful wall down. Just her, just this. She crossed the stage in 3 steps and walked into my arms. I held her the way I'd wanted to hold her since that first night on those steps, with both arms, without reservation. I felt her shoulders shake. I didn't try to stop either of us. The applause started slow and built fast, the kind that doesn't stop for a while. When we finally pulled apart, I leaned into the microphone still standing there. I said, "Blood doesn't determine who your people are. Choice does. Every person in this room who has ever chosen someone who wasn't required thank you. Keep choosing." A reporter caught me in the lobby afterward and asked what I wanted the future of Second Door to look like. I thought about the trust fully unlocked, about the second city I'd been quietly planning, Denver, because the foster care aging out numbers there were catastrophic, about the trade school partnership in Renton that wanted to expand, about Priya's folder of documents organized in order of priority, and Marcus, who was now teaching welding safety at the same school where he'd been a student. I said, bigger, faster, and a lot more second doors. Gracie was waiting by the coat check with both our jackets over her arm. When I reached her, she handed me mine without saying anything, and we walked out into the February air together. The water was dark and flat below the city lights. She pulled her jacket collar up and said, "For what it's worth, I had you figured out as my mom by about week 3. I said, "That is deeply unfair. I was trying to be professional." She grinned. "You brought me hot chocolate at midnight when I had a history paper due. Week 3. We drove back to Capitol Hill with the heat on and the radio low. The house was lit up when we pulled onto the block living room windows glowing, someone's silhouette moving through the kitchen. 7 residents, 2 caseworkers, 1 house manager who was definitely still up doing paperwork she was supposed to have finished yesterday. My people. Gracie was already out of the car before I killed the engine. She turned back and waited on the sidewalk while I locked up. The city was quiet except for a bus somewhere a few blocks over, its sound fading into nothing. I stood for a second with my keys in my hand, looking up at that lit house. I thought about a suitcase with a sticky note. I thought about a woman I had never met who'd built something from a bankrupt nothing in a city that wasn't hers, and who'd reached forward across a generation to press something into my hands that she never got. I thought about a cot in the back of a bakery in a cold winter, and the way one act, repeated enough times, becomes a life. Gracie called from the sidewalk. "You coming?" I locked the car. I walked up the steps. She held the door open, and the warmth from inside came out to meet me. I said yes, let's go in.